Okay, we're at the beginning of managerial accounting, and the first question we're trying to answer is how much does it cost to make our stuff? We decided that there are product costs, that's the cost inside the factory, and period costs, costs outside the factory. So once we decide what our product costs are, we have to track them. We have to trace them as they go from raw materials through our process into finished goods and eventually get sold. One of the challenges of this topic is information overload. So a typical textbook will have something called a cost of goods manufactured schedule. It'll have a job order cost flow, a job cost sheet. You'll talk about these cost flows here, and it's all the same stuff. It's not 8 different topics, it's all one topic. And one of the challenges is, for example, down here, the summary of job order cost flows. Well, the printer ran out of room, so they stuck cost of goods sold down here underneath finished goods inventory. When it's really just the same chart over here, cost of goods sold should be out to the right of finished goods inventory. So if you can understand the T accounts that we're going to talk about here, you will understand all these different concepts. For example, there's something called the cost of goods manufactured schedule. It looks very complicated, but all it is the number that comes out of work in process and goes into finished goods. That's the stuff that we finished, and it moved into finished goods. So like I say, we're going to just move our stuff from materials, labor, and overhead into work in process, into finished goods, and then eventually sell it. All right, so let's pretend we're making dining room tables. The big chunks of wood that we use to make the tables, that's direct materials. The line workers who are working on the tables, that's direct labor. But how are we going to apply manufacturing overhead? It's easy to keep track of the materials that got used and look at our time cards and see what we worked on. We're going to have a rule for manufacturing overhead. For instance, how about rent on the factory? How much rent on the factory goes into each dining room table? So before we sit down, before the year even starts, we have to create a predetermined overhead application rate. So let's assume that we think direct labor hours are a good driver of overhead. It's a labor-intensive business, and so we think that there's a connection between the consumption of overhead and direct labor hours. So at the beginning of the year, we sit down and we say, we think our total overhead for the year is going to be 100,000. We think our total direct labor hours for the year are going to be 1,000. So $100,000 divided by 1,000 means that our rule for credits to manufactured overhead and debits to work in process are simply $100 per direct labor hour. We might have done it per direct labor dollar. We might have also done it for machine hours. There's lots of different rules. For this simple example, the rule is $100 per direct labor hour. So before the year even starts, we have a overhead application rate. Now let's walk through these facts. We buy $100,000 of direct materials. So we debit direct materials for $100,000 and we credit cash. Accounting books always use accounts payable or other liability accounts, but let's use cash so we can not have to try to remember whether accounts payable is the good one or the bad one. And also, we're just going to use direct materials. This thing might also be called raw materials, in which case we would include not only the wood that we buy, but indirect materials like nails. And then what we might do is, if this is called raw materials, the direct materials would come out of here and go into work in process, whereas the indirect materials would come out of here, go down into manufacturing overhead, and get applied that way. The next thing that happens is workers work 40 hours in the factory at $50 an hour. That's $2,000. So let's credit direct labor payable and debit work in process. In this simple example, there's no indirect labor. What your book might do is they might call this thing factory labor. And so they're going to include in that not only the direct labor, the line workers, but also, say, the supervisors or the quality control folks. And so they might debit factory labor and then credit things like wages payable, payroll taxes payable, etc. And then move stuff out of factory labor. The direct labor would go into work in process then, and the indirect labor would come down here into manufacturing overhead and get applied that way. But in this simple example, let's just pretend like there's no supervisors, and let's pretend like there's no payroll taxes. So we owe our guys $2,000. We look at their time cards. We know they were all working in the factory, so it's all part of work in process. The next thing that happens is we buy more direct materials for $50,000. So these direct materials are sitting in a little area of the warehouse, are not on the factory floor yet. Somebody's in charge of signing these materials out, and so now they're sitting in his area, and he's in charge of keeping track of them. And again, let's not credit accounts payable, let's credit cash and pretend like we pay cash for everything. January 31st comes, and we look at the time cards, and our workers worked another 40 hours at $50 an hour. So that's another $2,000 that we owe them. And again, we're not going to call this factory labor. We're just going to pretend like all we have is line workers. We owe them $2,000. We know it belongs in work in process because they're line workers. They're working on the dining room tables. It's the end of the month, and we paid rent on the factory for $6,000. So that's monthly rent. It's on the factory, so it needs to be part of our product cost, but we don't know how much rent goes into each dining room table. So we're going to park that cost in manufacturing overhead. Then we pay utilities for the factory. Well, it's for the factory, so it's a product cost. How much of the electric bill goes in each dining room table? We don't know. So we're going to park that cost in manufacturing overhead. And finally, we pay for some lubricating oil used in the manufacturing process. Well, since it's in the factory, it's a product cost, but we don't know how much oil actually went into the manufacture of each dining room table, so we're going to park that cost in overhead. Then we check with the guy who's in charge of direct materials, and he tells us that workers signed out $100,000 of direct materials. So during the month of January, we took $100,000 out of direct materials and moved it into work in process. The next thing it tells us is that we paid our workers. We owed them $4,000, so let's pay them $4,000. And again, your book may make this way more complicated. It may call this factory labor, and it may include in factory labor the direct labor and the indirect labor. But for now, let's just keep it simple. We owe our line workers $4,000, so we recorded it as a payable. We take that payable off our books with a debit, and we credit cash for $4,000. Okay, so in the manufacturing environment, we have three kinds of inventory: stuff we're going to work on, stuff we're working on, stuff we're finished working on. Well, as far as the factory floor, the stuff we're working on, we've already taken care of the labor for this month and the materials for this month. We now just have to move the overhead in. And it tells us, it reminds us, that our rate is $100 per direct labor hour. Our guys worked 40 hours plus 40 hours, that's 80 hours. 80 times 100 is $8,000. So we're going to take $8,000 out of overhead and move it into work in process. Is that the right number? Who knows? This is just a guess that we made at the beginning of the year, and we're going to keep our eyeballs peeled to make sure that it's a good number. If you look at it now, you'll see that we incurred $9,000 of overhead, but only applied $8,000. So we under-applied overhead this month. If it's a good rule, next month we'll over-apply it $1,000 and it'll all even out. If at the end of the year we still have a balance in here, we'll close it into cost of goods sold. If it's a big number, we'll sprinkle some of it into cost of goods sold, some of it into finished goods, and some into work in process. But for now, at the end of January, we've applied $8,000 of $9,000 worth of overhead, so it's slightly under-applied at the end of January. Then the problem tells us that all the work is done. So we're going to take all $112,000 out of work in process and move it into finished goods, where it will accumulate no more costs. So what's the balance in work in process now? It's zero. $112,000 in, $112,000 out. Now we have to figure out how much it costs us to make each dining room table. It tells us down here that there were 112 tables made. If it costs us $112,000 to make 112 tables, it must cost us $1,000 each. So let's sell 100 of these things for $150,000, which makes sense. If it costs us $1,000 a unit, that means our cost of goods sold is $100,000, and we're selling them for more than that. We're selling them for $150,000. So we debit cost of goods sold and credit inventory for $100,000. That's the cost. Now let's book the sale. We debit cash for $150,000 and credit sales for $150,000. So what's the balance in our inventory accounts before we go any further? We've got stuff we're going to work on. We've got a $50,000 balance left. Work in process, zero. Finished goods, we've got $12,000. We've got 12 tables left. We made 112. We sold 100. So we've got 12 tables left with a balance of $12,000 in finished goods. So what's our little gross profit statement look like down here? In keeping with my own convention, it should be in red font. Our sales were $150,000 minus cost of goods sold of $100, so we made $50,000. And so that's all there is to keeping track of the flow of cost. We're going to take materials, labor, and overhead, move it into work in process, work on it. When we finish it, it moves to finished goods. And then when we sell it, it goes into cost of goods sold. Debit cost of goods sold, credit finished goods. I hope that helps.